Let's start with your novel, 30 Days in Amsterdam. It's a novel in which we get to know two people. Henk de Melker, who's someone who works in a museum and writes monographies about almost completely unknown people who've done something in their lives which makes them interesting to him, but it's all very marginal. He has an aunt who lives in Amsterdam, and she dies, and he goes to Amsterdam and stays there for 30 nights. And well, let's say his life changes after that quite dramatically in a few ways. And these chapters alternate. The chapters are of Henk de Melker, and the other chapters are of this aunt, which she has her own voice, her own idiom, her own way of speaking. I haven't read the original version. But in the Dutch translation, it works very well. It's an hallucination to read. It must have gave you a lot of fun to write that, to make her speak.
Yes. Could I just ask if you would forgive me, the people who are locked into English and English only, if one of you have the English novel here, I could maybe then read a portion from that? Not? Okay, I thought it's unlikely, but. Zan was a fantastic character to write. You know, Henk, as you said, a marginal character, someone who writes about uninteresting people, onmerkwaardige mensen, and those are the people who interest him. And he's very, as the Dutch would say, saai. In Afrikaans we say he's vervelig, but vervelig is a different word in Dutch. You would say he's a saai. And it was very difficult to write a saai character. It's a difficult thing to do. Henk is also marginal. He's a nerd. He's got limited vision. The whole novel consists of the vision of these two people. So Henk is locked into himself. He's got a very limited vision of things and knowledge and so on. Zan is totally crazy. She's the other voice. And she was actually easier for me to write because she's this compost of old Afrikaner myths and the Karoo language and songs, and in a sense she's an archive at a certain, I don't want to say at the end of history, don't quote me, but at a certain cultural juncture, I think, for Afrikaans speaking people, especially the community she comes from. She's this compost of memory. De roman als een soort geheue, as a kind of a memory. So that is the Zan voice, and she speaks. Mutilation is an important theme, as in many of my books, and she speaks this mutilated language. The syntax is mutilated. It's wrought. There are rhythm in language, and her rhythm is wrong in a sense. And the interesting thing, may I tell about the process of translation? Of course. The fascinating thing, Henk is easy to translate. Henk is just Henk. But to translate Zan's compost was extremely difficult for both the English and the Dutch translators. I call it Zan speak, which she speaks. And the problem there is that she speaks an unnatural language. But it's offered, at least in the Afrikaans, in a natural way. In other words, to make the language strange, also the things she sees, the things she remembers, her perceptions are distorted. And to translate that in order, or so successfully that it reads fluently and naturally. That was the big challenge for the translators. And I had a translation seminar last night at the University of Utrecht, and we had a lot of discussion on what makes a language specific and what are the cultural specificities in the rhythms of a language, in the memory of a language, and whether her voice works better in English than in Dutch. For me, it's impossible to say. I don't have a very good English ear, and I have no Dutch ear. So it's for me difficult to say, but this is what the translators were struggling with, is to translate Zan's speak into... for me, she came as a kind of madness, because she is crazy. She's a crazy character. She's as crazy as a coot. It's said in the book somewhere. So she's a crazy character, and I just slotted into, I call it a psychotic moment, which I had, and it just worked for me.
But it isn't an artificial language. It reads very natural. It is as if someone other than you wrote it almost. But it felt for you. It felt the same for you, probably, in a sense.
It was a. My wife always says she knows when my writing is going well when I tap out. I type with only one finger, and it's the same speed that I think. So I type very fast, faster than most people do, but with one. And if the other finger starts doing the rhythm, she knows it's going well. And with Zan, I could do the rhythm, but I struggled with Henk. I tried to do it. James could see a trick with Henk, and I couldn't do it, so it was more difficult.
Sorry, what did you ask?
Well, a spacer, a more muscular spacer style, a more absent style. He's quiet. He's teruggetrokken. He's a typical. Or he started out in my mind as a typical James Coetzee character. And of course he developed, and I think while he is in Amsterdam, he also moves further. And his language, this is what my Dutch translator said last night, his language also subtly changes and becomes more, let's say, more playful and so on, under the influence of him meeting his aunt. And
it becomes more articulate along the way.
Yes.
In a sense.
Yes. Yeah.
At the beginning of the book, he says, in one of the chapters in which we are with him, with this Henk de Melker, that family and secrecy are almost the same. Yeah. You can't imagine a family without secrets. Yes. That's a family has its secrets, and certainly his family has its secrets. There are loads of secrets in this book. Yes.
Well, you must look at the era I grew up in. And we grew up in an era of immense oppression and silencing in many ways. For example, Zan, the parts of Zan, a large portion of the book is set in the 60s in Graafrenet in the Karoo. And she obviously she's crazy, she's got all kinds of ailments, she falls down and she foams at the mouth and so on. But she didn't have the benefit of a proper education. She didn't go to university and so on. So her only way to protest the silence and the oppression, and to protest the secret, is to use her body. And she throws this body around in an extremely vulgar way, if you wish. It's a very erotic book in that sense. She uses her body to protest. And I call it the bodyography of Zan, because you must always remember, a book like this is only language. So a character in the book only exists in the language used. So this mutilated language is the mutilated body of Zan for me. And therefore I call it a bodyography. And this is her protest against silence. Now, Henkie grew up in the 60s. He was a boy then in Graafrenet in the Karoo. It's extremely conservative. Things are swept under the carpet. It's the church. It's the National Party. And things aren't said. Things aren't talked about. And this is the world Henkie comes from. And then Henk becomes a museum assistant. He chooses this quiet job where he can order things. Also, the whole question of the archive and ordering. In his way of handling this crazy family he comes from, and then he goes to Amsterdam, and then he meets up with the big silence of his background, in a sense.
He goes to Amsterdam and finds out a lot about the history of his aunt and about his own history. One of the aspects of that history is a rather dark side of the anti-apartheid movement, which he encounters. Did you do a lot of research to write about that?
No, you know, it's not a book about the anti-apartheid.
No, of course not. It's just one of the.
And it's just one of the little side shows.
Stories in the book.
And Zan is so crazy that it wasn't necessary to embark on a project to try and give the full picture of people who I believe played an enormous role in those years. I think the anti-apartheid movement was extremely important.
But you could write about it from her craziness.
I wrote about it from her craziness, and I wonder if one couldn't also say that it was written from a kind of anger about what is happening now in South Africa, and in a sense, maybe in a very unfair way, projecting back to those times.
Some of her rage must be in you, although you
think so. I think
described it as a psychotic experience. The voice that
I
came
think
to
so.
you.
There is in me. I'm not the kind of person, to go into a rage or rage about things. But obviously, there is a feeling that things aren't going well in the country at the moment, and maybe I projected that onto her. But I mean, she's so crazy. You can't really put your finger on it.
You can show your rage within the boundaries of your books.
I suppose.
That's the escape you have. Bart, you've read the book, of course. How did you read the passages about this anti-apartheid movement? Because you were active you were active in the anti-apartheid movement in Holland.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, the different anti-apartheid movements, if you call the liberation movement or whatever you want to call it in South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement, and I was, of course, part of what I used to call solidarity movement with that liberation struggle. Now, looking, there are all kinds of things in this great book, subtle things that refer to moments and people in Dutch anti-apartheid movement that are very recognizable for me. That some of them that I worked with, or they worked with me, and I understand that from a novelist's point of view, one has to, correct me if I'm wrong, simplify the anti-apartheid movement, the Dutch anti-apartheid movement a bit.
Well, crazify would be the word.
Sorry?
Crazify.
Crazy. Well, maybe,
yes.
Yeah. Also, but if you know, the anti-apartheid movement in the Netherlands, it was a combination, coming together of dozens of groups and organizations and people, and some people have been skeptical in those days. Say, why are you not working why are you not one organization? Because you're all against apartheid. But there were differences, and for instance, Etienne refers to this incident in Amsterdam where the books of the so-called Zuid-Afrika house that was looked at as an apartheid bastion were thrown into the canal by activists, we don't know whom. That was a thing that we despised as the anti-apartheidsbeweging Nederland, the organization that I was part of. Now, in the book of Etienne, all those groups are the anti-apartheid movement. Again, I understand, because getting in those subtleties, I don't think that anybody would understand. But somehow, that was a moment in the book that was difficult for me to identify with, because I thought, I was not part of that. There's another scene which is wonderful in a bar in Amsterdam where activists, you call them activisten, which some an estimation that's a bit too much that's in that formulation. Dutch activists sitting there with Zan and with Henk, Henk, I don't know, with Zan and a South African black activist.
Only Zan. Yeah.
Only Zan, yeah.
Yeah.
And then the attention of the crowd goes to the black activist. She's not there now. She might be a bit crazy, but it's very clear that it has to do with that he is the black. So we are with him, and she's a white South African. So that's fishy somehow. And I do.
But remember that it's all her parts are seen from her viewpoint.
No, of course.
So this is of course how she.
It's not a very reliable storyteller.
It's
Well,
not. She's not. She is the opposite of a reliable character.
Oh, but this is exactly
Yeah.
this is exactly an attitude one could find. I mean, I've seen that kind of situation. The only thing is that I was part of an organization that was founded by an Afrikaner man, Berend Skuitema, and that had close relations with.
We Facebook friends, me and Berend, and I've never met him.
We're talking about crazy, but anyway.
That's a different subject.
Yeah.
But if you, of course, you crazified
Yes.
the episode. It's a small part of the book, of course, in the end. But if you decrazify it a bit, there were darker aspects to the anti-apartheid movement. Probably, maybe more in hindsight than when you were in it.
If you talk about the darker side of the anti-apartheid movement, are you talking about anti-apartheid movement everywhere in Holland, in South Africa? So
Well,
you look at it as one thing, or what?
I don't think the book talks about the dark side of the
no.
anti-apartheid movement. No.
No, but the negative aspects or problematic, how would you define it?
Well, again, Henk read an article,
Yeah.
which is, Henk doesn't know. How must Henk know? Henk comes from South Africa, he comes and lives here, and he lives on the Spey, and he reads an article about, the anti-apartheid movement. So he quotes what he reads.
And what do you think?
I don't know. I think history is messy.
Sure.
I think there are a few episodes in history that aren't messy. So I'm sure there were messy episodes, yes.
No, sure. But I don't know. I think it wasn't new. That wasn't new for me. I'm not.
I
judging by
really
the book. I think I know those messy sides. Yeah.
Like?
Well, what we just spoke about, the throwing of books into the canal.
That again, as I said to you earlier tonight, is something which I again understand. I can understand that immense anger. And there you have in the middle of Amsterdam this archive of Afrikaans culture and Afrikaner culture, and storming it and throwing the books in the canal. Well, I understand that.
Yeah, but it was highly discredited.
Looking back, it is a terrible thing because it's a fantastic archive. It's the best collection of books on South Africa, outside of the borders of South Africa, books and documents. So it was a great loss if a lot of those documents got lost. But the anger one can surely understand.
Who of you present here knows about that episode? The throwing of these books into the Herengracht. In the 80s it was, mid-80s I think.
Yeah, it was in the 80s.
Two people know about it? So 3? So it's not 4, so it's not very much part of the collective memory in Holland.
No.
But in South Africa it's in the mind of Henk, and in the mind, but I don't remember that Henk addresses the issue in his portion. It's Zan. So in the mind of Zan, that would be big, because it was big news in South Africa, obviously.
But there's still some question about...
But I mean, this is such a small portion of the book. The weight of the book is such a protest against Afrikaner nationalism and Calvinism and the life in those days and the society Zan had to grow in,
That's why I wanted to get away from this subject, this particular subject, because it's about so much more. Well, it's a big book. It's 400-something pages, and it talks about so many things we can talk about, more than we can do in an hour and a half. But this rage of her, somehow there must have been a reason for you to let this rage escape in her as character.
Well, you know, the interesting thing is I had this aunt, Aunt Zan. Her name was Zan, and she had fallen sick. She was an epileptic, and she was absolutely quiet. She never said a word. She was a very quiet woman. And I think this was my way of giving voice to her.
She didn't say much.
She died when I was a small boy, and she was always there in the background, old Zan, always quiet, always moving like a ghost. And I think it's my psyche's way of suddenly saying, but she saw everything, you know. And now it's bursting forth. All that anger, of course.
But the real aunt was quite silent. She didn't speak much.
She didn't speak.
And you made her into somebody who can't stop speaking.
Absolutely. Now, when my family in Graaf-Reinet reads the book, they say, but it's not true. And I say, as I would say to Bart, it's fiction. It's crazy. It's a story. It's picaresque. It's a circus.
But those parts in which she speaks, you could also see it as a tribute to the Afrikaner language, although you invent a lot of language, and it is a mutilated language, as you just said.
Yeah.
But it's also, it's an expansion of the boundaries of the language you use.
I think
almost.
so, and I think it's a change in a lot of novels published in South Africa at the moment. It's a historical novel, and the historical novel which I mostly wrote earlier was either the magic realist novel, maybe you would know The Silence of Mario Salviati or The Betoverde Berg. But then and all of them are novels with a meta-historical consciousness, a very big consciousness of how history is written and how the truth, the reality is textualized, and cynical questions about how that happens. And a lot of South African fiction, written by people like James Coetzee, like Karel Schoeman, Andre Brink, names you may recognize, is meta-historical or meta-fiction with a historical theme. So it was the postmodernist turn which was strong in South Africa. And what we found the last 5 years or so was that a lot of novels were written in, especially Afrikaans, where the writers moved away from this meta-historical consciousness and moved to the use of the novel as I said, an archive. And the question is why? And I think it's unconscious. It's obviously a writer never goes and sits and think, oh, I'm going to do that. This is where I'm going to go theoretically. Something comes into your mind and you develop it further. And I think it's an unconscious gesture against times of change, probably.
Is it an archive of language?
It's an archive of language. It's an archive of old Afrikaans songs. One example, for example, would be Zan saying, "Aanstap rooies." Now, just this, so difficult for the Dutch translator to translate, because "Aanstap rooies" is an old voortrekker song, and it refers to the rooies, which are the oxen pulling the voortrekkers' ox wagons. So the song goes to this whole mythology of the voortrekkers and the whole power of trekking out into the so-called open landscape. But people of my generation used it ironically. When we said "Aanstap rooies," we meant, the Reds, the communists, you understand? And so, people reading that wouldn't know that. So it's an archive of old language, but then with all the layers of what happened after that included in it.
So it's almost a broadening of the language on the verge of its...
I think it's a stretching of the language. I think it's a testing of the limit of the language. It may also be in a situation where Afrikaans is definitely losing ground as a language, a gesture to show the power of the language, also unconsciously, not a decision, because the strength of a language and its durability comes from that which has been written in it, the breadth of it, the width of it. That's why you translate everything into Dutch. Imagine nothing was translated into Dutch. Imagine Marquez wasn't in Dutch, or Kafka. or Margaret Atwood, and you only had Hermans and Gerrit Achterberg and Lucy Bert and Groenberg. Strong writers, I admire them very much, but Dutch as a language would have been much more mager, like the magere brug. So we don't have that privilege of a lot of stuff being translated into Afrikaans here and there, a few Dutch books now and then, or English books, but I think it may be a gesture of Afrikaans writers to say, this is the energy of it.
Now the language is in a difficult position. Let's stretch it.
Yeah.
Maybe now is a good time to read
Yes.
a bit of your book. Now we've talked so much about the language,
Yes.
but didn't hear it. Well, not tonight.
For the English speakers, I was asked, unfortunately, to read in Afrikaans, so we didn't realize that there would be people, otherwise I would have gladly read a portion in English too. The part here is chapter 2, and that is where Zan has a lover. Zan is part of the Sobukwe cell. Now the Sobukwe cell isn't the official ANC protest cell in the 60s. Nobody knows who they are. They run by Cecil DiMaggio. He's an American, South African filmmaker. He's a crazy guy. He's got a few crazy guys helping him. And they're not sure, one isn't sure ever, even after reading the book, who they are. There's a distance between them and the official anti-apartheid people in Cape Town. They go down to Cape Town at some stage where they regard it as an embarrassment and as a rogue bunch of people. And Zan is sent to Amsterdam to get rid of her because she's an embarrassment to the movement and an embarrassment for them that people may think she is part of, let's say, officially sanctioned ANC policy. So this is still a scene in the book where Zan's lover, Weermeyer, Veer, as she calls him, Weermeyer was killed by Cecil DiMaggio in this crazy situation, and they actually are now on their way to burn his body, and they're taking Zan with them. Die straat is doodstil. Sondagmiddag slaap die grafenetters. Die dorp gaan lê soos 'n ou hond in die skaduwee. Henkie lê ook en slaap skeef oor sy bed. Sy kitty nog in sy slap handjie, sy albaster twak sakkie op die vloer, snork soos 'n hasie. Fioep, fioep. Ek kyk oor my skouer, en dis ek is nou Zan speaking. Ek kyk oor my skouer en ek is uit by die hek. Straat af, somers 'n straat, God verlate ou Karooland. Dit bak van bo, dit bak van onder, dit bak jou uit en gedaan, die son trek water, die son trek bloed. Nie 'n mens op Grafrenet se straat nie, geen kind mag in hierdie hitte buite speel nie. Die honde ken my almal, hulle lê in inritte en hyg van die hitte en hou my dop. Hul oë skuif saam met my skaduwee in die straat af. Ek kom agter by die tronk om. Dis maar 'n kort afstand om hier langs te ontsnap van die stuk vervelige Sondagmiddag met sy ruik van halleluja boeke en gebraaide aartappels en omgekeerde kluite in die roostuin. Sondagmiddag is so ruikerig en jy moet uit. Die badkamer ruik na ma Olivier se suur piepie en die kombuis na budgie saad. Jy moet uit, haas jou langsaam. By Henkie se kamerdeur stink die uitgeblaase voëleiertjies wat hy versamel. Stukkies droë geel sit binne in die doppies wat hy in rye watte lê. By die agterdeur ruik jy muurgif. Ek kom om by die spreekkamers, om by die landdroshof, om deur die warm strate met die teersag van die son, en as ek die peperbome ruik, weet ek die selfvensters draai na my, en ek ruik die bandiete, en ek sien hul bruin en swart arms met die pink handpalm steek by die tralies uit. Hulle verwag my hierdie tyd van 'n Sondagmiddag, en hulle waai. Nou druk die wind hier in die gleuf na my aan, die reuk van stinkvoete en hul tronk kos en hulle manne dinge en hulle asems en snotneus en ek ruik die tattoos op hul arms en die lemme wat hulle gedra het en die diep wonde van hul slagoffers. Ek ruik die stout en die verkeerd en die jasgeit agter die suikertjies aan en soos die pink palms van my waai as ek om die draai deur die drif en steeds is geen wit gesig in sig nie. As jy hier by die lokasie inkom op 'n Sondagmiddag, is die aangesig 'n veraf ramkikkie, 'n blik kitaar en 'n ou man wat stink van armoede, kop onderste bo, poegaai gedrink, sit onder 'n doringboom, lang nek kaaitjie het hy gesoen. Bra Zolani wag my in en trek die singplaat deur agter my toe ek by die kamertjie instap. Hy wag buite. Ek trek my rok oor my kop en die swart broek aan. Die halwe tennisbal is in die koffer en ek druk dit voor by my broek in, agter die gulp. Ek trek die hemp aan en die baadjie en die pruik pas mooi oor my kop. Dan die snor, kil jou hier, flous jou daar en sien daar wat die hart van vol is, loop die mond van oor. Ek maak my lippe wit en knip my wimpers en sit effe meer swart op die wenkbroue. Die manshorlosie wat altyd op die verkeerde tyd staan, die 10:10 horlosie op die regterhand en die pinkie ring van Cecil DiMaggio ook daarby. Ek kom uit en soos elke keer kyk Bra Zolani op en skud sy kop en lag. Hy gee my 'n sigaret en vat sy hoed en ons is uit op die stoep. 'n Hond blaf vir die vreemde wit man en Spandau kop lê bruin, geel en swaarmoedig in die middagson. Ons stap deur die strate agter die suikertjies aan en niemand maak met my oogkontak nie. Hulle noem my die bad news boy, so het ek gehoor. Hulle weet, Bra Zolani stuur my skadeloos deur hier, moeiteloos, almal is sy familie, sy tata of sy broer, of hy deel 'n ma met een en 'n pa met 'n ander. Bra Zolani loop wyd op arms en al wat lag is, vang hy soos 'n bal. Al wat groet is, ontvang hy soos 'n muntstuk in die hand en al wat raad is, sluk hy soos kos. Cecil DiMaggio wag in sy Cadillac, kap afgeslaan, tyres swart gepolitoer, bumpers blink gevryf. Hy bekyk ons soos ons aankom, ek in my swart flannel en my windmakerhoed. Ek lyk soos 'n handelaar of slim prokureur of gitaarspeler. En Bra Zolani met sy Sophia Town stappie, sy wit sakdoekie en sy baadjie sak en sy donkerbril, waarin jy als soos in 'n bioskoop kan sien afspeel, mooi verdubbel. Cecil klim uit toe ons aankom. Hy het 'n roomkleurige cowboyhoed op en 'n oopnek hemp aan en sy hare swankie gekam. Hy rook sy sigaret in 'n koker en die pinkiering is nes myne, net groter en agter die suikertjies aan en rooi. Ons het nie baie tyd nie, blaf hy. Sweetdruppeltjies sit op sy bolip. Hy maak die deure vir ons oop, ek agter Bra Zolani voor. Hy klap hulle toe en binne die kar ruik ek swaar parfuum en die nuwe plastiek van 'n kar vars uit die winkel. Cecil DiMaggio klim in en ons trek met 'n spaander van gruis weg, so dat die kinders agterna hol asof ons boksheroes of die welsyn is of van Graamsstad se Black Sash mense se sopkombuis. Juigend en die honde blaf en die boktrop teen die hang gaan staan en omkyk, elke enkelte bok versteen in sy spore. Ek moet my vashou. Here, ou baas hier bowe, help my ingord. Plaas 'n wag voor my tong, U is my inhou en niks sal my uitgaan nie. God, ek moet inklou en binne sluk en ek sit met my arms gevou. Vandag moet ek wys, ek skeur nie my kleure nie, ek strooi nie as oor my hoof nie. Ek laat Gods water oor Gods akker loop. Ek is my sout werd, ek moet hulle wys waar Dawid die wortels gegrawe het. Nou of nooit, Cecil het gesê, Zantjie, dis jou groot toets. Hierdie ding wat ons gaan doen, hierdie ding moet gedoen word. As jy dit onder die knie kan kry, is jy volwaardig lid. Hy het sy warm asem na my oor gebring van die sel. Ons ry sonder om te praat, krokodiltrane, maar niemand sien nie, ek bibber van verdriet en gril. 'n Lang dun pad, eers die kloofie toe pyl reguit deur die Haai Karoo. Agter 'n skewe boom hou ons stil, ry weer 'n entjie veld in, die veld is bibberstil en droog. Uitgestrek lê die wêreld en die droë keel van die aarde rasper. Hierdie plek, hulle noem dit Galgenbos. Die wind stoot hees, shush, maak dit. Cecil kyk na my. Hy trek asem diep in, hy maak die kattebak oop en daar lê hy nou, omgekrul soos 'n dooielike waan, sy tong dik tussen sy tande. Sy hemp het net een kol bloed en sy hande is agter sy rug vas. Sissel en Brazolani, tel hom uit, hulle het nie genoeg respek vir die lijk nie, en ek raas, ek huil, ek stamp my voete, ek kou my wangvleise, maar hulle sleep hom die sandsloot in. Brazolani gaan terug na die kar, bring die jerrykan en gooi die petrol oor hom uit en oor die sand om hom. Die stank van die brandstof vul die lug, die vlakte bibber soos die petrol verdamp, die turksvye trek krom, rooi blink loop die petrol teen die wang af en dam in die dooie oog. Staan tree, beduie Sissel, en druk my terug, want ek wil vorentoe. Ek onthou al die tye saam met die man wat daar lê, soos 'n nat gereende sak mieliestronke, sy lyf 'n sak niks. Dis in die oogpoelietjie dat Sissel die vuurtjie gooi, en met 'n ratsheid wat ons verbaas, spring hy soos 'n kat terug. Die vlam knetter en blaf oor die gesigvet van my geliefde, 'n lewestryder vir wat goed en reg is, agter die suikertjies aan. Ek het hom baie geruik wanneer hy poep, wanneer hy pie en ek onder die wind van sy dapper geel straal is, wanneer ek 'n stukkie was uit sy oor krap of hy sy oksel oopmaak. Ek het hom as man geruik, as seun, as vriend, as mens. Sy mens ruik soos vars gebakte brood of 'n peer wat jy skil. Ek ruik nou sy vetknetter, sy spiere vlam. Sy maag plof oop en borrels veg in die vlamme, maar God weet vernietiging. Vernietiging en die woede van die duiwel wen en stadig drolle in die maag inkluis waarna ek verbaas staar, soos die hitte en maagvel en dermvliese wegskil. Dit gaan als op in stoom en damp en vlam en hy braai kaaiing, my geliefde se skedel oopgebars en nat soos opgekookte kool. Hulle moet my die kar instoei. Die suilrook is 'n monument vir my minnaar. Stadig vlok die suil oop soos die wind daarmee lol. Later is niks meer oor nie. Sissel het die kar draadloos op LM radio aan. Suikertjies. Vera Lynn op 'n tam Sondagmiddag. Ek sit met my hand bak oor die halwe tennisbal agter my gulp.
Thank you. For the four people who only heard the poetry of the language in which you read this fragment, and who speak only English, maybe a little bit, it's difficult to summarize what you just read, but...
Again, it's through Zaan's perspective. This young man who's a lover has been killed. Why, we don't know. Whether it's common criminality, whether it's some crazy political move of this rogue cell, we're not sure. We don't know. The reader will never know. They've killed him. They load him into a car and they drive to this place called Galgenbosch. Now, if you know Graaf-Reinet, I don't think any one of you would know, but there's a place called Galgenbosch. There's a very well-known book written, The Plains of the Kamdeboe, and it's written by Eve Palmer, and it's about the Kamdeboe region close to Graaf-Reinet. And she writes also about Galgenbosch, which is a tree. And this tree is called Galgenbosch, a gallows bush, because this was a place where in the old days people were hanged. And often, and this is the historical side of it, people who were decided on by the authorities in the 19th century to be hanged, but also just rogue elements and even some Khoisan who were hunted down by the white farmers who were hung there. So, an awful place. They bring him there and they burn him. They turn him into ash. And she has to witness this, unfortunately. I think where I got the scene, it's always interesting for people, where the hell does someone's psyche get a scene like that? Because it's a horrible scene. I always feel I do violence to my audience if I read it, because it is really, it's yaggy, as we say in Afrikaans. In the 80s, we saw actually on television how people were necklaced, and that made such a big impression on me. And I'll never forget the first necklacing scene I saw on television. Luckily, never in real life. But it was a young woman in a township, and please, not the official anti-apartheid people to put a tire around her neck. She was seen by the community there as an impimpi being a traitor and someone who gives information to the security police, etc. And they actually put the tire around her neck, filled it with petrol, and burnt her. And you could see on television, the scene went on and on of this poor woman swaying, and of course all the ethics of reportage came into the picture. This television cameraman was just filming, and the crowd were crazy. And it wasn't a political thing, it was just the madness of the time. And she died there. She died on camera. And I mean, that made such an impression on me. And I think this is where the scene actually comes from.
Maybe the issue of the dark side, that speaks very clearly from this, from what you read, of course. And I could imagine that when there was an impression that this was an heroic struggle, with a very romanticized kind of impression, a Mandelaized kind of impression of that struggle. You could say it's a revealing book because it shows those sides. At the same time, I feel it's a naive kind of idea that one feels that this was all beautiful and great, and in a way, Dutch resistance or French resistance in the Second World War has been romanticized as well.
But it was interesting, the humor side, people always come in with humor om iets te verwerk, to deal with something. And I was then living in Grahamstown, also called Guinea by the Xhosa community, a very politically very active part of South Africa in the Eastern Cape, on the so-called Oosgrens. And when these necklacings started to happen, and it was an awful thing, and obviously the ANC, the whole democratic movement was as worried about it as other people, but the jokes started coming, as people tend to make humor too. And Grahamstown is the site of the higher court in the Eastern Cape, the Hooggerechtshof sits there. And there was also a Kelly's tire manufacturing company there, where you could go and get your cars, tires, and so on. And promptly it was called by the community the Hooggerechtshof. The idea that justice is done by the tire. And once I was walking with a friend of mine, and a car came past with tires on the roof, and he said, "You know what they call that now in the township? They call it the rondgaande hof." So that was interesting of those days. But it shows the fear and the brink on which South Africa was.
You think you relate, Bart, to this book differently than most Dutch readers would, because your activity, you lived part of the year in Johannesburg, for example, been active in it, or you used to live in Johannesburg? You do or you don't?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't get the question. What?
If you relate differently to this book than, let's say, somebody who isn't more involved in South Africa, in South African politics, and
it could be. It could be. Again, as I said, there are all kinds of things in the book that I'm kind of familiar with, or that. I see of course, the idea of fiction here. For me, it's difficult not to fantasize about all kinds of things that I've heard about like a white resistance group that started with Breitenbach, and you feel that there are elements of that story that got into the book.
You read it in the light of real historical events. And real
people, but at the same time, one doesn't need to be informed about those kind of things, because
But is it a different book when you are informed about these kind of things?
It very much depends on what you feel is being informed. There are people who have been part of the anti-apartheid movement or solidarity movement, and that maybe moved on all those years with that idealistic and romantic kind of idea that South Africa would turn into this paradise, and that the struggle that the people were fighting in those days was wonderful. And I never had that idea. And I haven't reinvented my own history. We were aware, I've been writing about all the troubles that happened around or in the surroundings of Winnie Mandela, and with her in the center of things. We've exposed in the anti-apartheidskrant in those days, in 87 I think it was, or 88, all the dramatic and horrible things that happened in the SWAPO camps in Namibia. So we were kind of familiar with those we knew about it. We met ANC people, dozens and dozens of the most wonderful people, but also people that you thought, oh my God, I really hope they will never get into power, this person, because they were power hungry and those. So in that sense, I think the book didn't surprise me, but it's still a courageous book, because not too much has been written about it so far.
But you see, again, it's not as courageous as you think, because it's not really, dit is nie 'n poging om daardie geskiedenis se donker kant werklik te. Ek dink die boek lê nog daar vir iemand om te skryf. I think there's a hell of a novel there. But my feeling about these things is that history is always messy, because it's driven by people. And history isn't driven by some strange force, or it's people, and people are messy. And you can't imagine the pressures people in exile were under. I mean, I knew, and everything. It must have been very, very difficult. And also inside South Africa, the people who stayed inside, it was a very, very painful and difficult and crazy time. So yes, you would get awful things happening, surely.
But despite fictionalizing, and despite it not being an historical novel in that sense, it isn't based on. You weren't.
It's a contra history in a sense, yeah.
But still, you wanted to say something about present-day South Africa.
I wanted to say something about present-day South Africa. Well, not as a decision, but I mean, it came out as anger. Because yes, there are big disappointments in South Africa, and we all know about it. It's unnecessary to list the litany of lists here and say this is these are the problems and this is what's happening. And there are many disappointments, especially because the surprise of what happened in South Africa was so great. I mean, the immense. I'll never forget. I was still in Grahamstown the day that de Klerk announced that he's unbanning the ANC, etc., that he's going to free Mandela. The absolute surprise, nobody expected it. We were absolutely so surprised. And then, of course, the wonder of what happened, Mandela as a personality driving it and so on. So I think it's inevitable that if things go wrong, I always say, South Africa is like the arts faculty at the University of Cape Town. It's ungovernable. It's so difficult. It's so complex. And it's.
But then why are you disappointed? Because
I think more than you, I was naive in those times, and I was young, and we marched, and we thought, things will be wonderful. I still remember us meeting the ANC in 1989. I was part of a group of mostly Afrikaans writers going up and meeting them. Then we slipped out of the country. And we met Steve Tshwete, Mandla Langa, the writer, Vernie February, that you would know. Breitenbach was there, Steve Tshwete, who's died in the meantime. And they were wonderful people. It was a fantastic thing for us. And I think we were maybe, too enthusiastic, but we needed the change so much that I think the disappointment is big for many people.
The whole world, you could say, was looking at South Africa then.
I think it was an example, a narrative, which.
But you feel South
also
Africa
as a country, I'm interrupting you, which is very rude.
Course.
But we also felt as a country for a long time that we can really offer ourselves because of the personalities of certain people in leadership of the ANC at that stage, we could offer ourselves as a narrative to the world and say, this can be done. You know, and there was a time when people said, but can't this country, can't Israel and Palestine look at South Africa? Why can't they do it? Look at them. Look what they did. No, those days are past. We're fast becoming a rogue nation again. We're making all these funny decisions at the United Nations. You know, we're siding with the wrong people. It's a strange situation. And no matter what the propaganda pumps out, we are in a difficult.
But a lot of people were angry back then about apartheid. In our part of the world, were joyous when de Klerk said, "This is it, it's finished." Yeah. But what do we do with this disappointment? We're not. Do you feel South Africa is alone in the disappointment?
Always remember,
we don't share the
when a
disappointment.
guy like me comes and I sit here and I blackmouth my country, which is a terrible thing to do, not so. The truth is, I live there. I love Amsterdam. A lot of you will know I come here very often, 3 times a year or so. I will never live here. You understand? Never. I won't make my life here. I can't. I love South Africa, and this is the case with most South Africans. So yes, it is a difficult country. It's been a terrible history. There's one portion in this book, I wish I could read it in English, but it's about the reality of a country where, you know, the poor Dutch came there in 1652. From my father's side, where my surname comes from, they came from the town Heerden, 2 brothers. That's where my surname van Heerden comes from. In 1667, they got on a ship, these 2 guys, and they came to look for respite in Africa, for work. They got out. They fled Europe, in a sense, because of probably economic reasons. I'm one example. The 1820 settlers, where my mother's blood, my mother was English, her blood comes from that side mostly. They were the poor people in Britain, and they were brought out and put there in the Eastern Cape on a piece of barren ground, and they had to sort that out. You know, the so-called colored community in South Africa, they carry in them the memory of slavery. They came from Indonesia, etc. The Dutch brought them, I may remind you. The Khoisan people, the son. I read the other day again a portion of James Coetzee's first book, Dusklands, where he writes this journal of this white farmer and the hunting down of the sun, you know, hunting them like rabbits. And this is the black population had immense tribal wars, terrible tribal wars. Shah Khan, these guys, they were terrible. And Fokker, Moorde and things. We all sit there, we've come together. The colonials drew a line on a map. History is saying to us, this is your country, this is your flag, hurrah, hurrah. It's bloody difficult. So we are doing very well, you know, with a very difficult crucible, I think. And what is interesting then, of course, for me, and I would like to hear what you say about it, is the feeling South Africans have that, my word, Holland is now being faced suddenly with so much of the same difficult questions, all these different energies coming in, which I find wonderful. If I walk around in Amsterdam, it's fantastic. It's a cosmopolitan city for me, and I'm energized by everything. And I was again surprised at dinner tonight to hear about the verrechtsing in Holland and how difficult it's becoming. And it's such a surprise for me. It's changed. It was like going to America in the old days and then going in the Bush era, 2 different countries. So it's to me a very interesting thing. And yes, I think Holland is, or the Netherlands, is there something pejorative in saying Holland? Not? No. Holland, in Afrikaans we say Holland. In Holland, there are many difficulties going to come, and if the verrechtsing continues, I don't know what may come.
For the people who missed it, there's a member of parliament called Martin Bosma from the PVV, the PVV. He went to South Africa to, as some kind of activist for the African language,
Yes.
and that's
For the Afrikaans.
Afrikaanse
Or
language.
Zuid-Afrikaans, as you would
Of
say.
course, which is in the 80s it used to be left-wing politicians going to South Africa to pay their to say we care about you, and now it's the right-wing party who goes to. But it's of course Holland has changed in quite a different way than South Africa, although we cope with it maybe a little some problems that are similar. That's probably easy for you to say something about that because you.
I think one of my main drives, and with many of my colleagues in the anti-apartheid movement, fellow activists or whatever you want to call it, was that the alternative that was developed by the ANC, the idea of non-racialism, the idea that South Africa belongs to everybody who lives there, white and black and white. So it was not a feeling of pittiness that we felt with the poor blacks. So it was much more the idea of alternatives, the intellectual level that we found in many people, and working on. It felt like a laboratory where people were working on an alternative kind of society. We would call it a multicultural society. And then the feeling was in those days, if they managed to do that in this ultra complex society as South Africa, then the problems that we face here with integration and those kind of things are really petty. You know, it's if they can make, and the irony of it all is that with all the critique one can have and the disappointment also about the new South Africa, but somehow it moves into that direction. And while we are moving into a completely different.
So you projected your dreams of a multicultural society that works onto the South Africa to be. And if that experiment would succeed, then of course I would say something about the Dutch experiment.
Well,
it wasn't without hope.
Etienne quotes in the book, I think, the hun strijd, onze strijd, internationale solidariteit. You know, what they are doing there, it's got to do with what we are doing here. That kind of understanding. In that sense, I'm disappointed. But when you were just talking about Amsterdam and the atmosphere of a free city as it was and still is in many ways. When I came back from Johannesburg in September, having been there for a while, and people asked me how it was, I was talking about Johannesburg, like you were talking about Amsterdam. You know, it's that. The only funny thing was that with quite a number of white friends that I came across there, that at some stage I felt, being depressed seemed to be a raison d'être of the progressive white person. They were all depressed all the time. And for me, and maybe it's got to do with the fact that I'm not a South African, so it's not in my system. And if something goes wrong, or if South Africa takes a stand in the United Nations, which is wrong, I suppose, it creeps into your system. It feels as if you are now being represented by the wrong people.
I think the big worry is that more than 50% of the young people under 35 in South Africa don't have work. More than 50%. Now, if you look at it, and you look at Julius Malema and the difficulties the ANC went through to handle him, you must realize one thing. He may be out of the way temporarily, but he is a very important figure in the sense that he represented a very real anger and desperation. And this is the big reality of South Africa, that you have so many young people who have geen vooruitzicht, no future, there are young people who are third generation of people without a job. The father didn't have the job, the grandfather didn't have a job. Often the mothers work as domestics. Women keep things together in that country. But this is a big worry for South Africa. And it's not only the white people who are worried about it. The black middle class, which is rising and growing, they are also extremely worried about it. But the politicians somehow can't get it together. you know. And this is and it's if you don't see that, you know, you are blind. You are blind. At the same time, it's a country of great joy and energy. You know, my wife was here with me for 4 weeks in Europe, and she went back earlier, and she said to me, the energy here, you know, it's incredible, and just the different way of life, and it is that's why one can't get away from a country such as that, and maybe that makes the disappointment bigger because all the potential is there. But you know, we have wonderful young people. I teach at the University of Cape Town, so I work with classes of young people from a Muslim background, Xhosa-speaking young people. We don't get many Zulu-speaking young people because we're far south. We get students from the rest of Africa in our postgraduate programs. I work with white Afrikaans-speaking, a lot of English-speaking white kids. I'm calling all the different colors and shades of green and blue and pink because this is the wonder of South Africa. And they are wonderful young people. They sit together in class, we have wonderful discussions, very positive. But they are the elite. You know.
Can something arise from that disappointment? Disappointment is not very well known for its...
If you speak in just economic terms, I'm no economist. If there's someone in the audience, please help me write. But I saw figures of the projected growth of nations across the world the other day. And the groeikoers for South Africa, for Africa for the next year is seen as about 4.7%, I think. And for Europe it was 0.02%. So Africa as an economic power is growing, definitely. This is one of the big surprises. South Africa, of course, is one of the developing economies, such as India and Brazil and so on, and China. So economically speaking, there, you know, things are right. But it'll have to translate through not only to the elite.
But can you be
I'm included in the elite, please. I'm white and privileged. But it can't just translate through to people who have.
Can you be disappointed and hopeful at the same time?
Of course, of course. I mean, I have 2 kids, and both of them are outside of the country at the moment studying. And I'm worried that they won't be coming back. And many parents, black and white, tell their kids, get out. You know, go and look for work elsewhere, settle down elsewhere. I'll never do that because I think we've done it for so long. We will do it again. We will not be, you know, not be stopped to live a life.
You wanted to say something, Bart?
How do you define the elite? Because it's about 4 to 5 million black people that enter the middle class.
Yes.
I think that's quite a result. You know, that's quite.
It is a big result. It is a big success.
And the word elite, it suggests, in my feeling, a bit too small kind of top group.
No.
So,
I mean people who would have a car. I know even poor people have a car in the Netherlands, I hear. And they have cheese in the fridge. But with us, when people are poor, they are dirt poor, and they are under the hunger line, you know. So yes, we have a growing middle class, but money tends to circulate, you know, on that level. True. I wish I was an economist. I would be able to give you figures, but the gap between rich and poor in South Africa is growing. Absolutely. This is well known. Yep. It's widening and it's growing, and this is a silly situation. It shouldn't be. Sure. Now, so many people are willing. So many people in that level of having a family car and up are willing to pay more taxes only if they know the taxes will be spent properly. This is the second thing. You know, the corruption is terrible, so one would like to see a better spread of wealth and income and so on, but it's very difficult to know if you pay taxes where your money, to see where it's going, you know.
So tax in South Africa, I mean, it's one of the bigger success story of this government for the past 20 years.
Yes,
I mean,
they've
it's
become very
billions
strict.
and billions
Yes.
more than
Yes.
was budgeted
Yes.
for every
Yes.
year.
Yes.
And so, again, I don't want to disagree on your worries about the gap, which is enormous, about the malemmas of this world. And though I see in malemma also an example of a cover-up of self-enrichment in the most terrible way, but I also see that there's an atmosphere and the realities that he makes use of.
That he makes
so that's
visible.
Exactly,
he makes
exactly.
It visible.
And
although he's a Cecil DiMaggio.
exactly, exactly. So if I respond, I'm not going against those worries, but I do feel that some of the successes of the South African governments from 1994 should be mentioned, and they should be credited for that. At the same, if you look at the economy, the 4 or 5% growth that you're talking about, I mean, you need 10 or 12% growth if you want to do something about that 50% of youth being unemployed. And one of the problems of South Africa is, I think, that different from most other African countries, that it's so much connected to the world economy. So all the problems that we have here will immediately reflect in the South African economy. And that also is something that I find it difficult to blame the new powers.
Maybe now's a good time for questions from the audience. If there aren't any questions, of course, from the audience.
Yeah, please.
At least one.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Maybe before you answer the question, can you repeat it
yes,
for the rest of
the
us?
question basically goes to the core of what people often say, and that is that the old leaders, if you think of Sisulu, if you think of Oliver Tambo, if you think of Nelson Mandela, of the old gentleman Mbeki, Govan, Tambo's father, and so on, these people came from an old style education, school system and education and so on. So they were a very special bunch of guys, very special. And the question then is the current leadership who are in government, is it fair, do I understand you correctly, to expect of them to be of the same premium quality? I don't know, but I think it is fair. It's not fair to be too idealistic or too naive in your expectations and think that a governing government will have the same magic than the leaders of a freedom movement which is respected and successful. That would be unfair, but it's quite fair if you're a citizen of a country to expect certain things from your government. You wouldn't expect this and that and that and that. And that means we must expect the best from our leaders. There's no other way. If I propose I'm going to be a member of parliament, I have to deliver. There's a certain contract there between the citizenry and the leadership. That's the social contract in a sense. And yes, we must expect the best. And we do have a few excellent ministers. Pravin Gordhan, who's the man who handles the tax, is excellent. We had Trevor Manuel, who was the Minister of Finance, who was seen as one of the best ministers of finance in the world. He's moved now to Zuma's office in a special position where he's not successful, where he's struggling. so we have a few ministers which are good, but then you have a terrible situation. The health system in one of our provinces, Limpopo, I just read on the internet 2 days ago, is collapsing totally. Now my wife is a medical doctor and she's in a private practice. And again, it's this elite medicine, looking after people, who can afford it. The situation in the hospitals, the state hospitals in many places where she used to work for most of her career, in Grahamstown and in Zululand where we lived for long, it's collapsing. We've got friends who are doctors all over the country and social workers and so on, and it's collapsing. But other things are going very well. More people have water than ever before. You understand, etc., which is important. Imagine not having running water close to your house. It's so important. So yes, there have been successes and so on, but we have a feeling that there's a basic drift away from the ideals of the Constitution, and that basically is my biggest worry. My biggest worry is that there's a lot of noise about the constitutional court. There's a lot of noise about the power of the judiciary. There's a lot of noise about the general beskikbaarheid, availability of information. You would know about this debate around the Protection of Information Act. There's a lot of problems around cultural dimensions, about language, for example, and so on. The school system isn't working. We get students at the university that really haven't come through schools, where teachers rock up at 12 o'clock in the morning. They don't come to their job. It's sad stories. And there's not enough control. There's not a will in many senses. And if one would go and tick, it'll be difficult to say. It'll be more positive than negative. It's going to be very difficult. But then the people are so fantastic. The country is fantastic. There's so much pride, of sort of what has happened in the country. So I think it's positive in that sense, as a living space. But don't say that to one of those 50% young people, because they would say, "Are you crazy?"
You wanted to say something, Bart?
Well, I want to come back to the question, like the Mandela and Sisulu's and Mbeki's, the older generation. I actually feel that there's still a potential in or around the ANC from that kind of leadership. But the tragedy is, I think, that under the Mbeki government, quite a number of those people have been sidelined. And as a result of that, we've got Zuma now. But of course, there's a number of things like the abuse of state institutions and state power for the political agenda of the former president, the arms deal, which is of course something that totally corrupted the ANC. I agree that if you look at the histories of people like Sisulu or Mandela or whatever, and German or English missionary education have been extremely important, and all kinds of factors played a role there. But I think the kind of tradition that they represent is broader than those people and is still there somehow, but being sidelined and should be renewed again, should be digged up. And if that's going to happen, we must see, of course.
I just before we take another question, I just think always of Obama. You remember how wonderful he was, the idealism, and then the reality of Washington. He runs into all these walls, and it's so difficult, So governing is no joke.
Are there any more questions? It's not, to answer your question, it's not only about into Afrikaans, but it's into Xhosa.
or from Xhosa into English, or from English into Zulu, from Zulu into Pedi. So we have 11 languages, and there's not funding as you have in Holland. In Holland, you have a state-supported structure of translation, and people who translate my books make more money out of the Dutch edition than I will ever make. That's the truth, of course. So it's and that's really the economic truth of it, and it's because there's a lovely, fantastic system here, that worthwhile literature. It's an attitude which is translated into a will by those governing. In South Africa, the attitude hasn't even grown. That yes, we need, things in languages to enrich our languages, to nurture all 11 languages as our cultural heritage. That will isn't even there, and so there's no chance that we will have a state subsidy for translation and so on. You have to go and look often as a writer yourself for funding to translate your book into one of the other languages. If you're a more well-known writer, it's easier. For other writers, it's virtually impossible. And it's becoming more and more difficult. That's
interesting, though. If 50% of the young people are unemployed,
yes. Exactly.
how difficult can it be? I mean, you know what I mean? It would seem like it would be economically feasible to hire someone who doesn't have a job. I don't understand. Those two things don't jive for me.
Yes. Well,
I'm naive, perhaps.
I will never say that.
Or you have the solution.
Or you're being very practical.
There are 2 more questions. One over there, or 3 more questions. Okay, let's do 3 more questions, and then you'll be the last one.
Okay. I just recently came back from South Africa for the first time.
Yes.
And so I was so curious. And then what I saw, what I heard, it's like 50% unemployment, and a tendency that the decline of employment, the population of the white, they are going away. The young people are leaving.
Yes.
Because there's a kind of policy which quota for the blacks, so for education, for jobs, and so they're left with no other alternative. And make the problem more serious is that the influx of migrants from neighboring countries. And I heard there are many different types of migrants from Zimbabwe. They're very, very educated.
Millions and hardworking people.
And they're taking jobs
Yeah.
from the
Yeah.
black South
Yeah.
Africa.
Yeah.
And,
They say there are 2 million Zimbabweans in South Africa. Yeah.
yes, and also other neighboring countries
Yes.
come selling drugs and all these things. I don't specify who
Yeah.
they are, but
Yeah.
they're very.
But what is the question you want to ask?
So I see this country is beautiful. I was so amazed of the beauty of the country. But why can't they, with the enormous resources that they have,
Yes.
to move into a positive
Yes.
direction?
Yeah. Well, we hope it will happen.
Yeah,
We hope, because those are very different problems, the drug trade and international criminality coming to, for example, Cape Town. It's big. It's Chinese gangs, it's Russian gangs. If you only look at the drug trade, South Africa has become the gateway to the drug trade in Africa, So each of these things have different forces working on them. I think there's enough money in that country to do anything. The interesting thing is so many buildings are going up and so on, but again, it's top-level stuff.
And the corruption.
Corruption is big, yes. But corruption was big under the apartheid government as well. But it's big, yes.
Okay, there were 2 more questions. One from you.
A totally different one.
Yes, sir.
I was really impressed by nearly the finish of the book, in Zam comes back to the Karoo.
Yes.
And the Karoo plays a huge role in not only this book, but more of your books.
Yes.
But also the urban landscape in Amsterdam in this 13 nights. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you play with the interaction between landscape and characters?
Yes, I think this novel is a novel about displacement. It's about people who aren't there where they would be at their most happiest or nurtured. Zan is in Amsterdam, and Henk comes to Amsterdam. He gets mixed up with buskers and not the official Amsterdam population. So it's a novel which looks at Amsterdam from the viewpoint too of pickpockets and the marginal, the movement, the migrants and so on. And the Karoo is seen as the heartland, the place to go back to, and this is why at the end they actually go back to that. Zan actually left South Africa because she was removed by the movement, but also because she wanted to get away, from. So it's about being unsettled and then longing to go back, and like so many people in this world who land up where they don't belong or don't want to be, but they have no other choice. It's a novel of place and displacement, which is a theme of a lot of writers in this world. Because I'm sure if you look at Dutch literature written from the Antilles and Suriname and so on, it's also a theme you'll find there. If you read Tipmarig's book, De Morgen Loeit Weer Aan, you can see this immense problematic of not belonging where he is, the main character. Difficult. But at the end they go back to the Karoo and they go back to, I was actually asked to read the last short chapter, so I'll read that at the end if there's still time. But I can just talk about it, it's the chair's choice, but at the end they go back.
No, please read it, please.
Yeah.
Please do.
But I'm now very conscious of people just hearing gibberish when I read, because they don't understand.
Even if you don't
Afrikaans.
understand, it's beautiful to listen to.
It's a story what I'm reading. So it's the last chapter, chapter 58. And Henk and Zan has now gone back to South Africa. Zan has cancer. And they come to this place where this body was burnt, Galgenbosch. And they are going to look, because Zan remembers as the body burned and petrol was poured over it and it was burnt, one vertebrae didn't burn. She still remembers it lying there in the ash. And she goes back decades after with Henkie. They go and search for this piece of wervel, we would call it in Afrikaans. What would you call it? A rugwervel. Piece of backbone of her lover. En dan is daar die askol. This is this place of ash where they burned him. Die nooit volprese altaar, die smeltplek van my weemeier. Die kar hou stil, God verlate. Kraaie, Henkman draai sy ruit af. Ek klim uit kaal gat soos my vinger. My wee, hy is nou wind en weer, hy is nou verneweerde aarde. Henk huiwer, klim ook uit. Doef sy deur, askies. Ons begin werk. Snuif rond, ek en Sherlock Henk, soos twee muishonde, boggelrig, met ons sniffels teen die stof. Waar is die laaste van my nooit gesê, my uitgehik, my Karel Weemeier? Dis oor sy asplek dat ek nou staan. Dis oor sy asse dat Henkman toorder aangeloop kom, in sy hand die ene vraag, die ekskuus, maar is dit? Duisel gryp my, o God, skud my uit sy mou, en ja, lig soos lank gelede, lig soos die dag van gister, so lig die wit been wat hy my gee, stoffies afgeblaas, oorblyfsel, kaal gevreet deur mure. O Here Jesus, my verloder, my ook nooit my huil, agter die suikertjies aan. O, dis oor sy asse dat ek begin dans. Henkman kyk verbaas, kyk nou weer tante, o wee is jy my vroeggesteelde, my eerste gesmaakte, my kort gebaker, my kort voorlank. Dis Henkie wat kyk na my paringsdans, bleek Henkie beenman offergawe, maar dis Henkie wat my dop hou en sy arms losknoop, dis Henkie wat glimlag nou, voor die hele wêreld vry. Kyk dan nou, die nader kom Henkie, They dancing. Kyk hoe Bond staan, sy oë op my voete, my riel aan het optel. Ja, kyk Henk so en so. Brazolani het my goed geleer, geskoffel het ek teen lokasiekop. En 'n volkskool se saal onder ballonne en streamers, die two-step en die twist, die jakkelsdraf en die cha-cha. My voete oud en wees, maar my voete is twee handsie slim. Kyk Henk, so my China, gooi hom. Ek hou rielend die trofee omhoog, die uitgebakte, die wit gekalkte, die skrikbeen, die gebeente, my wese wervel, bokant my kop reikhalsend. Henkie lag, Henkman lag en huil, sy arms is soos op Dominee Paai, gaan nou in vrede, loskom Henkie. Hy wil saamdans, my melktuintjie, dans. Die stoffie staan, die vlakte kantel, skoffel, stappie, juig, sprong, jive, uithalers, kudoes van die vlakte. So dans ons, die laaste van die melkers van Somersetstraat. So at the end they dance on the site of history, of the ashes of history, where the most terrible things happened, and they dance this dance which consists of the jive, which is a township dance, the cha-cha, the foxtrot, which is from the English, the Khoisan dance, the reel, which is from the Khoi, and so they dance all these dances together, and they come back, in a sense, and it's a celebration of, I think, the terribleness of history. And whether it's a positive ending at the end, one doesn't know. I don't know, certainly.
There was still one question, I think, was over there, and that will be the last one. It wasn't a question. What? About the translation of other African languages, yeah.
There is. Yeah. Yes. 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 Yeah. No, the book industry is struggling in South Africa.
And they asked me to repeat the questions
Yes,
that are
sorry.
being asked from the audience, but since the questions are quite long, it's virtually unrepeatable. So maybe you can, when you answer the question...
Well, it's just a question
tell us a little bit
about the
question
production
itself.
process and of books and the expense of books and the fact that there isn't large readership in South Africa. One of the big worries is that the black population, and sorry to generalize, but I'm on the board of a big publishing house, it's the biggest one in the country, and we are worried the black population isn't buying books. It's bookshops in the cities, and it's white readers, and black writers are frustrated. They will not talk about it, they don't like it, but they will say privately to you it's terrible for them. They write fantastic novels, but they're read by middle-aged white women in the very affluent suburbs. And they go into these readerships, they go into the festivals, and they perform for these people where there's a crowd of 100 to 200 white faces, and then they go home to their township where no one knows who they are and won't read their books. So it's very difficult. As an Afrikaans writer, I'm privileged. Also, the colored Afrikaans writers are very privileged. Someone like Ronaldo Kamfer is read by all Afrikaans speakers and admired very much. So we who write in Afrikaans, there's a readership, and we sell much more books in Afrikaans than in English fiction, for example, in South Africa, because the English writers are up against Rushdie and Philip Roth and whoever is writing now on the world stage. So but it's difficult. The publishing industry is struggling.
But of the number of books that, of course, you're right, but I feel like coming up, nuancing here again, because the number of books that come out. I mean, when I moved to Johannesburg in 1993, it is maybe a handful of bookshops in Johannesburg. One was exclusive in Hillbrow, in the middle of Hillbrow. And, well, let me exaggerate a little bit. Once a month you went there to find the new book that has come out. And it's new titles coming in on a daily basis, and there's a discussion also amongst some publishers that whether they don't agree too quickly with publishing work of new black authors, because they feel, we must bring out black authors, but the quality is not always that good. So, but there is this upcoming generation of people that want to write, and now we need to create a generation
of readers. And what this publishing house, which I'm affiliated to, is doing is to we've launched a very accessible romantic series of romance, and we have commissioned people who aren't really writers, but they're young black executives who know the commercial side of Joburg the life. And they write these romances, and it gets packaged in a specific way, and it's sold in supermarkets. And this is the way to create a readership. The big media companies have started Pony Courante, what do you call that? Pony Pers? The real cheap sensationalist papers. You don't have it in Holland. Tabloids, sorry, tabloids, of course. Do you have tabloids here? But real tabloids.
No, not real tabloids. No.
Oh, well,
no,
there's a few, like the Sun, the Daily Sun, die Son sien alles. And it's just 6, and how terrible people are, and so on. And this is to create a new readership of newspaper readers. And now if you go into a factory in Cape Town or so over lunchtime, everyone's reading the Son. There's a nude on page 3. It's all about sexual exploits, but it's the first generation of newspaper readers. Their kids are going to school, some to university. Those kids will migrate up to a next level of new. So yes, there are many positive things happening, and companies are trying to do interesting things.
Thank you very much. Thank you much for being here. There's no nude on page 3 in this book.
There's a corpse on the second. Do you know Dion Meyer, the writer? And Dion said to me, he writes criminal novels, crime genre, and he said to me, there's got to be, at the latest, a corpse on the first quarter of the second page. So I've just completed the first draft of a new novel, and I put a corpse on the first page. So. Thank you.
For the people who haven't read the book yet, you can buy it downstairs. Thank you very much.